You think you know the story of King Alaric IV, the mighty ruler who united 3 kingdoms. But history has been lying to you. The real Alaric wasn't a hero, he was a monster. A king so grotesquely obese he had to be hoisted around like a sack of grain. His festering leg wounds stank so badly that servants fainted just entering his chamber. And when he finally died, his corpse exploded, showering the streets in royal rot. This isn't a fairy tale of kings and crowns, this is a horror story history tried to bury. Section 1. The Myth versus the Monster. King Alaric IV is often remembered as the father of the unified realm, the man who forged 3 fractured kingdoms into one mighty empire. History books paint him as a brilliant leader, a warrior poet, and a king blessed by the gods. Statues across the empire show a young, strong monarch wielding a sword and wearing a crown of gold. But the truth? The real Alaric IV was nothing like the legend. He was a grotesque tyrant whose cruelty and paranoia turned his court into a living nightmare. His body decayed while he was still alive, his mind rotting alongside it, until even his most loyal subjects whispered of him as the walking plague. By the end of his reign, Alaric's body was so swollen and diseased that he couldn't walk unassisted. His attendants used an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys to hoist him between chambers like some monstrous marionette. The stench of his unwashed flesh and festering sores was so overpowering that courtiers carried perfumed cloths pressed to their noses whenever they were forced to approach him. One chronicler from the era, a terrified monk named Brother Dallin, wrote, "The king's odor announces his presence long before he is seen. It clings to the walls and tapestries, a smell of rot and corruption that no incense can mask. Those who serve him are cursed to breathe in his decay." But Alaric hadn't always been a monster. As a young prince, he was charming and athletic, skilled in riding and swordplay. People adored him. That all changed on a stormy spring afternoon during a royal tournament, when Alaric suffered a catastrophic jousting accident. His horse stumbled mid-charge, and the prince was thrown violently to the ground. Witnesses claimed he lay motionless for over 2 hours, his face pale, his eyes fluttering like a dying bird's. When he finally awoke, he was different. At first, the changes were subtle, wild mood swings, sudden bursts of anger. But within months, those closest to him began whispering that the prince they knew had been replaced by something crueler and far more dangerous. Some modern scholars believe the fall caused severe brain damage, triggering both his erratic behavior and the physical ailments that would later destroy his body. By the time Alaric ascended the throne at 28, the darkness inside him had already begun to take root. And soon, it would consume an entire kingdom. Section 2. The Corpse That Walked. When Alaric first became king, his transformation shocked the realm. Gone was the lean, golden-haired warrior prince the people had adored. Within just a few short years, his once athletic frame ballooned into a grotesque mass of flesh. Royal tailors struggled desperately to keep up with his ever-expanding waistline. Records show his ceremonial robes required entire tapestries of fabric to create, and by his mid-30s, Alaric's waist measured over 60 inches. This wasn't just gluttony. His body swelled unnaturally, his skin stretched thin and waxy, his legs mottled with purple sores that oozed foul-smelling pus. Physicians at court whispered of a mysterious illness, though none dared name it aloud. To even hint that the king was ill was considered treason. One unfortunate healer made the mistake of recommending that Alaric reduce his diet and undergo a purification ritual. The king's response was chilling. "Are you saying," Alaric hissed, his lip curling in rage, "that the body of a divinely appointed ruler is flawed?" "And no, my liege," the trembling physician stammered, dropping to his knees. "Good," Alaric sneered. "Because a flawed king is no king at all." The next morning, the physician's head was displayed on the palace gates as a warning. By then, even standing caused the king agony. His legs were riddled with ulcers so deep that fragments of bone were visible through the flesh. Chroniclers described the smell as unbearable, like a battlefield after a summer rain. The stench wafted through the palace corridors, and servants drew lots each morning to determine who would have the misfortune of tending to the royal wounds. One servant, a young page named Alaric, reportedly vomited upon seeing the king's legs for the first time. Alaric had him flogged so severely that the boy never walked properly again. From then on, the chosen attendants wore thick layers of scented oils and herbs in an attempt to mask the odor while they worked. Even so, many fainted or fled mid-duty, only to be hunted down and executed for dereliction of service. Alaric's paranoia grew alongside his physical decay. He became obsessed with hidden threats, convinced that assassins lurked around every corner. He demanded secret tunnels be built beneath his palaces, not for escape during battle, but so he could move unseen and eavesdrop on his own courtiers. Some claim to have seen the king's enormous shadow gliding silently through these hidden passages late at night, accompanied only by the faint wheeze of his labored breathing. It was said that if you heard the wet shuffle of his feet behind you, you'd best pray to the gods, for it meant the king was listening, and you would not live to tell what he'd heard. The courtiers began referring to him in whispers as the corpse that walked, a blasphemous nickname that could cost one's life if overheard. And Alaric, though he never heard the words, seemed to sense their fear, and reveled in it. Section 3. The Wives' Nightmare. History remembers King Alaric IV as a man with 5 wives, 2 of whom met the executioner's blade. But those cold numbers barely scratched the surface of the living nightmare these women endured. To marry Alaric was not a privilege, it was a death sentence disguised as a crown. Alaric's first queen, Lady Seraphina of Vainer, had been his childhood sweetheart. Their early years together were marked by genuine affection, and for a brief moment, it seemed Alaric might rule as a benevolent monarch. But after his jousting accident, and subsequent personality shift, Seraphina became his first victim. As Alaric's paranoia grew, he became convinced that Seraphina was conspiring with rival noble houses to poison him. He would summon her to his chambers in the dead of night, his voice a hoarse whisper, his bloated face inches from hers. "Tell me, dearest," he would croon, "do you dream of wearing a widow's veil? Do you and your secret lovers plot my death while I sleep?" Seraphina denied the accusations tearfully, but Alaric's mind was beyond reason. He forbade her from speaking to anyone outside her chambers and surrounded her with spies disguised as ladies-in-waiting. When she begged to see their daughter, Princess Elara, Alaric laughed in her face. "The child is mine," he snarled. "You are merely the vessel that bore her." Seraphina died mysteriously 2 years later. The official record claims illness, but witnesses swore she had been poisoned by order of the king himself. Her final days were spent writing desperate letters to her daughter, letters Alaric burned without reading. Alaric's second wife, Lady Mirabell of Othwain, suffered a fate even more grotesque. She was barely 16 when she was wed to the king, a political alliance forced upon her by her ambitious father. At first, Alaric lavished her with gifts, silk gowns, jeweled tiaras, and entire banquets thrown in her honor. But his affection was a twisted game. One evening, during a feast, Alaric announced before the entire court that Mirabell had betrayed the sacred bed. 5 men were dragged into the hall in chains, accused of lying with the queen. One of them was Mirabell's own cousin, a young musician she had grown up with. As Mirabell screamed her innocence, Alaric forced her to watch as each man was executed in increasingly brutal ways. The musician was saved for last, beheaded while Mirabell was made to hold the blood-stained lute he had once played for her. When the last body fell, Alaric turned to his trembling queen. "Now," he said, voice calm as winter, "you will confess." Mirabell never confessed, but it didn't matter. She was executed at dawn beneath the very window of her chambers, her head displayed on a pike while Alaric dined on roasted boar. By the time Alaric wed his third queen, Lady Alina of Korath, the court lived in constant terror. Alina's beauty was legendary, her golden hair and sharp wit captivating nobles and commoners alike. But she understood her husband's madness better than anyone. She learned to smile at his gifts, to laugh at his cruel jokes, and to hide her revulsion at his decaying body. Behind closed doors, however, she plotted her survival. When Alaric's paranoia turned toward her, accusing her of plotting with foreign emissaries. Alina did something none of the others had dared. She signed a false confession claiming their marriage had never been valid. This clever act saved her life. Alaric, pleased to humiliate her publicly without needing to kill her, allowed her to live out her days in quiet exile. Alina became known as the Ghost Queen, rarely seen but forever feared. As the years passed, the pattern continued. Alaric's last two queens lived in constant dread, never knowing whether they would wake to a day of feasts or a day of executions. The palace halls echoed with weeping at night, and the noble families of the realm began to view marriage to the king as a punishment rather than an honor. Whispers spread through the court. The king does not wed for love. He weds to destroy. And no one, not even the queens themselves, knew who would be next. Section 4. Feasts of Madness. If King Alaric's treatment of his wives revealed his cruelty, his eating habits revealed the depths of his madness. He did not simply feast like a king, he consumed like a beast, as though devouring the world itself would fill the void gnawing at his decaying soul. The royal kitchens were a sprawling complex beneath the palace, manned by over 300 servants who worked day and night to satisfy the king's insatiable hunger. Chroniclers noted that 800 dishes were prepared daily, not for the court, not for the noble guests, but for Alaric alone. His table groaned beneath entire roasted stags, towers of sugared pastries, whole barrels of spiced wine, and exotic animals brought from distant lands, peacocks, swans, even a rumored phoenix carcass that had been preserved in honey for a year before serving. Each meal was a performance, and the king was the star. Alaric would be wheeled into the hall on his custom-built chair, his body wrapped in layers of perfumed silk to mask the stench of his sores. Musicians played triumphant fanfares as servants unveiled each course like sacred offerings. Nobles were required to sit and watch silently as the king ate, a ritual that could last 4 to 6 hours. And Alaric didn't merely eat, he theatrically dissected his food, often while addressing the silent court. "This swan," he once announced, holding up a glistening leg of meat, "will grant me the grace of a god." He tore into it with yellowed teeth, grease dribbling down his chin as horrified courtiers watched. "And this stag," he declared another night, raising a dripping haunch, "shall make me the fiercest hunter in all the realm, even if I never lift a bow again." He devoured oysters by the dozens, claiming they enhanced his virility. Whenever he took a new wife, the consumption of oysters doubled, as though eating them could force his diseased body to perform the duties of a husband. But his paranoia tainted even these gluttonous displays. Alaric was obsessed with the idea of being poisoned. Every dish was tasted by 3 separate servants, each waiting 30 minutes after sampling before the king dared touch the food. This delay turned meals into all-day affairs, and the tension was unbearable. One evening, a young taster collapsed, not from poison, but from sheer exhaustion. Alaric, convinced it was an assassination attempt, ordered the boy boiled alive in one of the massive cauldrons used for stewing meat. From that day forward, no servant dared show even a hint of weakness near the royal table. The kitchen itself became a military operation. Guards were stationed at every doorway, and ingredients were inspected with the precision of a battlefield commander. Salt, sugar, and wine were sealed in special containers marked with royal sigils, and anyone caught tampering with them faced immediate execution. One terrified cook reportedly dropped a sack of flour on the floor and attempted to sweep it up before anyone noticed. A guard spotted him, accused him of sabotage, and dragged him screaming into the courtyard. His body hung there for 3 days, covered in birds, a grim reminder to the rest of the staff: mistakes are treason. Even as his body rotted from within, Alaric believed himself untouchable. He saw his ever-growing girth as a sign of divine favor, a physical manifestation of his absolute power. But the truth was far more horrifying. The very food he consumed was killing him slowly, his organs straining beneath the weight of his excess. His sores worsened, his breathing grew ragged, and by his final years, attendants had to carry buckets behind his chair to collect the foul fluids that leaked constantly from his decaying flesh. Still, the king feasted on. And the court watched in silent, terrified awe as their ruler ate himself into ruin. Section 5. Web of Paranoia. As King Alaric's body decayed, his mind unraveled even faster. By his final decade, the palace had transformed from a seat of royal splendor into a labyrinth of fear, where no one trusted anyone, not even their own families. Alaric's paranoia reached heights that would make even the most ruthless modern dictators seem sane. He saw plots in every whisper, treachery in every glance. The walls themselves became tools of surveillance. Under his command, engineers constructed hidden peepholes and listening tubes throughout the palace. Courtiers never knew if they were truly alone. Even the most private conversations could be overheard by unseen spies crouched in the shadows. Rumors spread of secret passages beneath the palace floorboards, tunnels so narrow that only the king's smallest agents could crawl through them. At night, courtiers claimed to hear the distant scuttle of movement beneath their feet, a reminder that the king's eyes and ears were everywhere. "There is no privacy in Alaric's court," wrote Brother Dallin, the terrified monk chronicler. "Even silence itself may betray you." The king's personal chambers were the most fortified area of all. Alaric refused to sleep without 6 armed guards stationed directly around his bed, their crossbows loaded and pointed outward. Beneath his pillow, he kept a pair of silver daggers, polished so meticulously that attendants could see their own terrified reflections in the blades. Every night before sleep, he interrogated his guards personally. "Tell me," he would hiss, his breath foul with wine and decay. "What did you hear today? Which noble spoke too softly? Which servant lingered too long near my wine cup?" The wrong answer meant death. The right answer? Only slightly less dangerous. Even his children were not spared his suspicion. Princess Elara and her half-brother, Prince Maler, were watched constantly by their father's spies. Letters from the princess to childhood friends were intercepted and burned. Tutors were replaced monthly to prevent indoctrination. At royal banquets, Alaric forced his children to taste his food before him, a grotesque display of mistrust that left the young prince trembling each time he lifted a spoon. One evening, Elara dared to ask her father why he treated them like criminals. "Because, my sweet daughter," Alaric said with a chilling smile, "every dagger that might pierce me is held by the hand of someone I once trusted." The king's obsession with poison reached absurd extremes. Meals were prepared in sealed kitchens where the staff themselves were locked inside during cooking, only released once the dishes were delivered. The wine was poured directly from barrels kept under armed guard, and even water was filtered through elaborate contraptions of silver and glass to prevent tampering. A separate team of spies existed solely to watch the food tasters. These spies, in turn, were spied upon by other spies. This recursive network of mistrust grew so tangled that eventually no one knew who was loyal to whom. False accusations became weapons. A minor courtier might whisper to a spy that his rival had plotted against the king. Within days, that rival would vanish, dragged to the dungeons beneath the Tower of Bleak Water, never to be seen again. The dungeons themselves overflowed with prisoners, nobles, servants, even children, whose only crime had been standing too close to Alaric when he was in one of his black moods. Torture chambers ran day and night, their screams echoing through the stone halls. "Each sunrise brings new accusations," Brother Dallin wrote. "The court lives not by loyalty, but by fear of who will be next." By the end, Alaric didn't merely punish crimes, he punished thoughts. He began ordering executions based on dreams he claimed to have received from the gods. If he dreamt a noble was plotting against him, that noble was dead by morning. Once, he awoke screaming from a nightmare in which his own reflection tried to strangle him. The next day, he ordered every mirror in the palace smashed to pieces and executed the glassmaker who had crafted them. The realm had become a theater of madness, and Alaric was both playwright and executioner. No one, wife, child, or courtier, could escape the suffocating reach of his paranoia. And as his mind rotted alongside his flesh, the kingdom itself began to decay. Section 6. The Death of a Tyrant. By the winter of his 57th year, King Alaric IV was more corpse than man. His skin, stretched tight and pale as candle wax, cracked and wept foul-smelling fluids. His body had swollen so grotesquely that servants used ropes and pulleys to hoist him from one chamber to another. Pieces of decaying flesh would fall from his legs as they moved him, leaving a trail of blood and rot across the marble floors. The stench of the king's body was so overpowering that even the most hardened courtiers gagged when they entered his presence. Buckets of incense burned constantly in his chambers, but the smoke could not mask the smell of death. His own guards wept silently while standing vigil, their faces hidden behind perfumed cloths. Alaric's final days were spent in a delirium of fear. He accused invisible assassins of lurking in the shadows, screamed at shadows on the wall, and once tried to stab his own reflection in a bowl of wine. "They wait for me," he whispered to his daughter Elora during one rare moment of lucidity. "Even the worms beneath the earth plot my undoing." When death finally came, it was less a passing than a cataclysm. His body convulsed violently, the gases of decay trapped within him causing his abdomen to swell like a grotesque balloon. When he finally exhaled his last breath, a long, rattling groan echoed through the chamber, chilling every soul present. No one dared approach the body for hours. To touch the king before he was declared dead was treason, but so was allowing him to lie unattended. The royal physicians argued in hushed voices, terrified of being blamed either way. Section 7. The Coffin Disaster. The royal undertakers faced a nightmare unlike any before. Alaric's corpse was so bloated and unstable that they wrapped it in layers of lead and sealed it within 3 separate coffins. Even then, the weight of the body caused the wooden supports beneath it to groan ominously. The funeral procession from the capital to the royal crypt at Stonevale was meant to be a display of majesty. Instead, it became a macabre parade. On the second night of travel, disaster struck. As the procession passed through a small village, the gases building inside Alaric's corpse reached a critical point. With a sickening crack, the lead lining burst open, and the king's rotting remains exploded outward in a spray of foul fluids. The smell was indescribable. Witnesses fled screaming as chunks of royal flesh splattered across the road. Dogs rushed forward, licking greedily at the remains before horrified soldiers beat them back with pikes. The procession halted for hours while servants scraped the pieces of their once mighty ruler into buckets. Brother Dallin recorded the moment with trembling hands. The king who ruled with divine right was reduced to carrion, devoured by beasts and washed into the mud. Thus ended his reign. Section 8. A Kingdom's Curse. The burial itself was no less chaotic. The crypt, built to hold the king's massive coffin, began to collapse under the weight of the lead and rotting flesh. Workers scrambled to reinforce the structure, but cracks spread through the stone walls like veins. Some whispered it was the earth itself rejecting Alaric's presence. Even after he was entombed, strange phenomena plagued the site. Villagers reported hearing wet, ragged breathing emanating from the crypt at night. Others claimed to smell the stench of rot carried on the wind, even years later. Priests declared it a curse, the lingering malice of a tyrant who had never truly left the mortal realm. Many who had handled the body fell ill and died within weeks, their skin erupting in lesions eerily similar to the king's ulcers. Some believed the disease was a punishment from the gods, a reminder of the corruption that had infected the throne itself. Section 9. Legacy of Fear. Alaric IV left behind a unified realm, but at a terrible cost. His children inherited a kingdom steeped in fear and suspicion. Elora, now queen, struggled to undo the web of spies and secret tunnels her father had created. But mistrust had seeped so deeply into the court that even her most loyal advisors plotted in the shadows. The common people remembered Alaric not as a warrior or builder, but as a monster who devoured both food and lives with equal hunger. Ballads of his cruelty spread across the land, sung by traveling minstrels who dared to mock him only now that he was safely in the ground. The king who feasted on fear, one song went, whose body burst like his rule, left not a kingdom united, but a graveyard for fools. His true legacy was not the empire he built, but the lesson of his downfall. That unchecked power can rot a man's body, mind, and soul until he becomes something less than human, and far more terrifying. Section 10. The Final Whisper. Years later, Brother Dallin returned to the crypt to make one final entry in his chronicle. As he knelt before the massive stone slab that sealed Alaric's tomb, he swore he heard a faint sound beneath the earth, the slow, wet shuffle of footsteps. Terrified, the monk fled, dropping his quill in the mud. His last words, scrawled hastily in the margins of his journal, were barely legible. "The corpse that walked does not sleep." And so the legend of King Alaric IV lives on, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning. For even death could not fully silence the horror he brought to his people. The realm would rebuild. The songs would change. But deep beneath the earth, in the darkness of his crypt, the rotten king waited. And listened.